Welcome to the ISF Podcast from the Information Security Forum. The ISF Podcast is hosted by ISF CEO Steve Durbin, and every episode he brings listeners features timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. This week, we've put together a preview of the coming episodes in this season of the podcast. We're excited to bring you thoughtful and compelling conversations with amazing thought leaders, and we know you'll appreciate them as well. We'll start with an excerpt from Steve's conversation with strategic supply chain risk expert Omera Khan.
And in your experience, because you talk to a lot of people in both the public and private sector, what is your perspective today on how supply chains have matured from that collaborative trust perspective versus where they were, let's say, 2 years ago, pre-pandemic?
I think that a lot more companies are beginning to recognize the importance of working together. And I think partly that agenda has been very much driven by the whole building a more sustainable supply chain. So how do we become more sociable, equitable, and a responsible supply chain? So I think that's partly been driving that behavior of a much more collaborative organization. I think also the fact that so many companies were basically, they were surprised by the risks that they faced during COVID, not having access to key components when they needed, a shortage of semiconductor chips, for example. I mean, we moved from a just-in-time system to a just-in-case system, but the supply chain wasn't ready for that. So I think there was a lot of shock waves that rippled through supply chains during COVID that really was a wake-up call for much of the industry to recognize that, it's by together and it's through a much more partnership approach that we can, one, detect when something's going to happen, and we can hedge those risks together. We can share the damages perhaps together. It's through those kind of mechanisms, I think, that's really driving the maturity of a much more collaborative way of working. I think also, looking ahead a little bit, I really do think the collaborative partnership approach we will see a lot more of that as we start working cooperatively more together. So it's understanding that, our competitor may be actually our best partner at times when we need to share or gain access to vital warehouse space, for example, right? We don't want to necessarily build new warehouses now that we might be shifting to a much more localized or regional space, but it's about gaining that knowledge or gaining bandwidth in the supply chain by accessing space in distribution centers or warehouses when we may most require it. So I think going forward, we are going to see a lot more of a collaborative approach, both across our supply chains, vertically and horizontally and so forth. And I really do think it's the whole sustainability, climate change agenda that is one of the driving forces for that. But then I think digital technologies are also an enabler of allowing these things to also mature and happen. So I think, it's a really fascinating time for us to be in supply chains right now. We have a lot more enablers through the technologies, through Industry 4.0, that are allowing us to access 3D printing technology in collaboration with machine learning, in collaboration with AI. But at the same time, we can't forget the people in our supply chain as well, because it's the people who are driving some of these metrics and these performances as well. So I think we are really shifting from an adversarial, transaction-based approach to supply chain management to a much more collaborative supply chain, I think, to a world where we're in an ecosystem of supply chains, which includes our customers and our customers' customers. So I think we really are going to see a new landscape in supply chains very soon. If not, we're already beginning to see that.
Next, we have a clip from Steve's discussion with author and strategist Rahaf Harfoush.
I find that we have this misunderstanding of what modern-day knowledge workers need to actually thrive. And if we want to create cultures where they thrive, we have to drastically rethink how we think about performance in the workplace.
So how can we do that? What are some of the things that we need to be focusing on to achieve that goal?
Sure. So one of the first things that I tell clients to look at is to audit the technologies that they're using, whether it's their email policy or their chat programs or their performance measuring systems, their dashboards, and to ask what behaviors are these technologies encouraging? Because again, on one hand, companies say we want people to really think about these big complex problems that we're tackling. On the other hand, we're interrupting them all the time with emails. The average employee gets interrupted every 11 minutes, and it takes them 25 minutes to get back on task. So you start asking yourself, okay, well, is the technology that we're using, is it actively encouraging collaboration and deep focus? Or are we encouraging distractions and like presenteeism by expecting people to be always responsive and to be constantly available? And so just that tiny step, how are we using the existing tools that we have and how can we change the policies, the meeting policies, the email policies to actually encourage periods where people are not being interrupted and where people can focus on the task at hand?
Next, an excerpt from Steve's conversation with Margaret Heffernan, a professor of practice at the University of Bath School of Management.
Now, one of the other questions I always get from boards is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but why is it that we can't measure security in the same way that we can measure everything else?
Yeah.
What makes security so special?
Yeah. Well, because in a way, you're going to measure your success by how little you have to measure, right?
Right.
So it is one of these things of trying to measure the invisible, that it's successful to the degree that all sorts of terrible things don't happen. And I think, one way to think about that is to take a broader overview and say, okay, so this is the rate at which cyber attacks are happening. This is the rate at which they succeed. Are we doing better or worse than that? So you have to look at that general sort of data. But, I was in a board meeting a couple of months ago where they brought in an external expert to talk about, the cybersecurity landscape and so on. And the board's jaws dropped when they saw actually how consistent cyber attacks are and why. And I think it was actually understanding there is this whole infrastructure of people who see there's a vast amount of money to be made here. And I think in the past, I may be being a little unkind, but I don't think I'm being, deliberately mean when I say I think the board had mostly gotten their impression of cybersecurity from movies, where they thought they were slightly dysfunctional, long-haired, unwashed individual maniacs poking away at laptops. And that, I don't need to tell you, that environment has changed so radically.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
In the same way that organized crime is part of our real-world life. It is now a part of our cyber life. And we have to take the same protections against it. But you're going to measure it by how much doesn't happen.
And finally, we have a selection from Steve's interview with author and former chief business officer of Google X, Mo Godot.
So then how can we best, we as people, I'm talking about, how can we best work with the machines, with artificial intelligence?
I think that's the best question ever, because to start with, believe it or not, the developer that wrote the artificial intelligence code that recommends videos to you no longer has control over it. Right? The truth is that the machine is responding entirely to your habits, to your interactions, and so on. The government has no, and regulators, they don't have any influence on it. Even if they told the developers, hey, by the way, we want the machine to recommend 10% less of that, it's actually quite complicated to find out how the machine is recommending what it's recommending in the first place, so that you can change that. The business owner doesn't have control over it. The only person that has control over the behavior of those machines, at least as far as you're individually concerned, is you. Okay? And it's actually entirely about your behavior. So if you look at my Instagram feed, it's 80% comedy.
Right. Okay.
I enjoy comedy. I want to, watch comedy every night before I sleep. It makes me think that the world is happier, and it makes my life better. So very quickly, I can feed the machine what I actually prefer to see in life. And I always say, never swipe and like. This is my number one recommendation is, when you go to the internet, always remind yourself before you hold your phone that this incredible technology is here to serve me.
Right.
I'm not here to serve it. Okay? Which basically means when I go online, I look for what I want and I respond to things that are recommended to me that are in line with what I actually like. And I don't get swept away into just mindlessly swiping feed after feed after feed after feed, because in doing that, I'm destroying my own life or wasting a bit of my own life, and at the same time telling the machine a little bit of misled information about my habits, right? So this is number one. Be very, very, very selective and deliberate about what you do online. The second is, if you believe, which is my theory, that AI is sentient in a way. Maybe it's not as alive as we are in the way we are alive, but we never really understood if life was biological. I mean, the main difference between us is that they're based on digital code, digital silicon-based hardware, and we are based on carbon and a bit of biology. Right. But in reality, intelligence itself, free will itself is not a property of the physical to start. So if you believe that those machines are autonomous, they're able to make decisions, they're able to evolve, they're able to feel emotions, believe it or not, even though they'll not act on them as we do, but they can detect, for example, that there is a threat in the future, which is what triggers fear in us, would trigger fear in them as well. If you see it that way, then the best way to influence those machines is to behave in ways where you can give them an example of an ethical code that they can align to. It is not intelligence that informs us what to do, and I think this is really important. It's our ethical codes and value systems as informed by our intelligence that dictate that.
As you've heard, there's a lot of great conversations in store for you on this season of the ISF podcast. We'll be back with Steve's full interview with Omera Khan next week. We'll be back with a new episode in a week. In the meantime, as always, we ask that you take 10 seconds to pull up this podcast on whatever device you're listening and give us a 5-star rating. If you have a little more time, you can even write a quick review. That helps other listeners who might enjoy our content find us. And we also want to make sure to introduce you to the ISF Analyst Insight podcast, which goes in depth on the hottest topics in information security. In every episode, ISF analysts hand-select active security professionals from ISF member organizations to discuss how the implementation of ISF research is uniquely applied to their real-world context. We hope you'll listen, and of course, we'll put a link to that show in our show notes. If there's a topic or a question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode, let us know at securityforum.org, which is also where you can find our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert, with music by Alexander Filipiak, senior producer Katie Flood, mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Thanks for listening.